Reading Hub event, we are going to discuss an interesting book on the changing geopolitical contours of South Asia. It's called Comrades and Mullahs, written by two of my colleagues, Jony and Ananth Krishnan. Before we get into the discussion of the book, I request my colleague Dharan to give a short introduction to the Reading Hub and our activities. Dharani, please.
Good evening. Thank you to Panneerselvan for inviting me to give few words on Dravidian Professional Forum and Reading Hub. So Dravidian Professional Forum was started sometime in 2019, and we relaunched it probably in once again in 2019 December. It was first launched in March and then relaunched in December 2019. The reason why we started Dravidian Forum was, there are very few movements like that have lasted more than 100 years. And one such movement is the Dravidian movement, which was actually started as a Justice Party and became Dravida Kalagam and Dravida Munnetra Kalagam. But what we now have is being taken for granted by the present generation. But these are the things. For example, Tamil Nadu now has a GR about 52%, and education is accessible to everyone. But 40 years back, 50 years back, 100 years back, not. If you go 1920s and look at people in white-collar jobs, they belong to just one or two communities or from certain top echelons of the society. So we wanted to take to the present generation, and more so to the youth as well as to professionals on how this was made possible in Tamil Nadu and how we have such a unique growth situation where Tamil Nadu is the only state in India where we have the best metrics for socio-economic growth as well as the best metrics when it comes to industrial growth. So we want to take this to the youth. And second, we also wanted to provide policy solutions to the government. Most often, the problem with public policies, we don't have evidence-based or data-backed public policy. We wanted to do that. And third, we also wanted to unite all the intellectuals together. And finally, for any movement, ideas are the lifeblood. And I think through Reading Hub, the Dravidian Professional Forum intends to rekindle new ideas. Thank you.
Can we also patch Ananth? Dear friends, today's book is being authored by Ananth Krishnan and Jony. Stanley is here. Ananth is joining us from Beijing online. Ananth is there. Ananth, can you hear us?
Yeah, hi, good evening. I can hear you. Sorry that I was muted, but now I've been allowed to unmute. I hope you can hear me and happy to join you.
Yeah, thank you for joining. See, this book becomes extremely important for two reasons. One is, when I came to journalism, that was in 1984. One second. Okay, yeah. Tell me when we can start. Okay. See, when I entered journalism in 1984, Afghanistan was viewed through a strictly Cold War prism. It was Washington versus Moscow prism was a dominant narrative, and in that, Pakistan played a much bigger role, because Pakistan was seen as part of the US axis. And in fact, the terminology in Islamabad in those days is, we are governed by 3 A's: Allah Army and America. Therefore, this Allah Army and America viewpoint of Islamabad was a one prism through which Afghanistan was viewed, because there was a huge Soviet presence. After the collapse of Soviet Union and the rise of Taliban, there is a completely different geopolitical reality which has emerged. I would like Jony to explain, how do you look at the travel of the Afghanistan from the last days of the Cold War to its present situation where we have the government led by Taliban? Can you summarize?
Good evening, everybody. First off, thanks to Roja Muthaiah Library for organizing this event. And thank you very much, Panneerselvan. So when we come down to this topic, especially when we look at Afghanistan's, let's say that the different phases Afghanistan went through over the years. So as you said, in the 1980s, Afghanistan was ruled by the PDPA, People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which was the Communist Party, backed by the Soviets. The Soviet troops went into Afghanistan in 1979. 1978, the Communists took over power. 79, the Soviets were there. And the Soviets stayed in Afghanistan until 1989. So interestingly, if you look at the, late 1970s, the context, the historical context of the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. So the 1970s, largely, if students like us, when we turn back, look at the Cold War, 1970s largely was seen by the communist bloc that the United States was suffering a series of setbacks in the 1970s. For example, in 1975, the Americans had to withdraw from Vietnam. And in 1979, there was this, early 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Iran was one of the pillars of America's foreign policy in West Asia, and the United States lost Iran for good. So and the Vietnam withdrawal was a major setback to America's, global, the perception of the American power globally. So it was against this context that the Soviets actually misread the United States, capacity to bounce back. And the Soviets found it as an opportunity to expand their influence. And then they went into Afghanistan. In 1978, they orchestrated, within the Soviet-backed coup took place and the communists took power. 1979, they went into Afghanistan. And then, they orchestrated a coup within the country and then got a pro-Soviet leader in power in Afghanistan. So this was the context of 1970s. While on the other side, the United States, having suffered a series of setbacks, geopolitical setbacks in the 1970s, saw the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan as an opportunity to, fix whatever or to make a comeback. Because what the Americans thought was that, yes, we had our Vietnam, we got stuck in Vietnam, we had to exit Vietnam in a humiliating way, and now this is our opportunity to create a Vietnam for the Soviets in Afghanistan. So in the we have actually explained it in the book, dating back to the late 1970s when Pakistan started directly supporting the Mujahideen factions in Afghanistan, the anti-communist Mujahideen factions in Afghanistan. So the Americans and the Saudis and the Pakistanis, they came together, backing up different Mujahideen factions who fought against the Soviets, which eventually led to the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan was as humiliating as the American withdrawal from Vietnam, because the Soviet Union, the mighty Soviet Union in Afghanistan, was just in the backyard of the Soviets. And 10 years, the Soviet Union used, brute force in Afghanistan to quell the rebellion, the Mujahideen insurgency, but they failed to do it. And the Americans were also supplying, anti-aircraft missiles. Reagan started it, which brought down the Soviet jets, and eventually the Soviet Union founded after Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. They found it untenable to continue the Soviet presence in Afghanistan in 1989. The Soviets were forced to withdraw from the country. But then you see, 89, the Soviets were out. At that time, if you look at the literature of 1980s, late 1980s, everybody expected that the PDPA government run by Mohammad Najibullah, would collapse immediately. But that didn't actually happen because the Soviet aid kept coming into Afghanistan. And the Najibullah government kind of, stick on. And in 1991, but the Soviet Union collapses and the aid dries up. So that gave an immediate boost to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Whereas on the other side, the Najibullah government lost its most important backup, which was the Soviet Union. So within a few months, in 1992, the Najibullah government actually collapses. So bringing an end to the communist experiments of Afghanistan. So at that time, there were different Mujahideen factions fighting against Afghanistan. So immediately after the fall of the Najibullah government, what we saw was the Mujahideen coming to power in Afghanistan. So from the communist government to an Islamic government, Afghanistan becomes Islamic Republic. So it was Pakistan that orchestrated and one conference of the different Mujahideen factions, and then they came up with this Islamabad agreement to form the Mujahideen government. And as part of that, you had a Mujahideen government in Kabul. But the Mujahideen were different factions. There were, there was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, he was one warlord, and then Burhanuddin Rabbani was there, who was a Tajik. Hekmatyar was a Pashtun. And then you had different warlords representing different ethnic groups within Afghanistan. So they never managed to come up with a united government in Kabul because their, the uniting factor was their fight against the Soviet army initially, and then the PDPA government. And once both were gone, these Mujahideen factions started fighting each other. Because in Kabul, you had this government led by Burhanuddin Rabbani, who was the president. And Ahmad Shah Massoud was its defense minister. Ahmad Shah Massoud is widely known, no? The Lion of Panjshir, the legendary Tajik war commander. So Ahmad Shah Massoud was the defense minister. But at the same time, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar fell out with Burhanuddin Rabbani, and he was fighting to take over Kabul. And it was in this background, and the Pakistanis were directly supporting Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And India did not recognize the Mujahideen government because India had very deep ties with the communist government. And the communists fell and the Mujahideen came to power and the Indians were reluctant. The same ambivalence you see today. Because Indians saw that this was the first time Pakistan brokered agreement bringing a government in Afghanistan, and an Islamic government was formed in Afghanistan. But Rabbani actually traveled to India in 1993. So while going to Indonesia to attend the non-alignment summit, he took a stopover in New Delhi, and India allowed him to take the stopover in New Delhi. That was the beginning of a thawing relationship between these two. And eventually, India built very strong ties with the Mujahideen government, especially with the faction of, Ahmad Shah Massoud. Whereas Pakistan was betting on the Pashtun militia group led by Burhanuddin Rabbani. But eventually, what happens, when during the civil war period, roughly from 1992 to 1996. So by 1993, 1994, the Taliban were rising as a madrasa movement from Kandahar. So the Pakistanis also found that Rabbani, though he was, he continued to fight Kabul. He's also called the butcher of Kabul because he was shelling the city from all sides. So Rabbani, but he was ineffectual. He wasn't able to take over power. Whereas the Taliban from Kandahar was rising fast by 1994. So Pakistan had also shifted its support directly to the Taliban. And with the help of the Taliban, with the help of the Pakistani military establishment. By 1996, the Taliban became the most important and most powerful militia group or insurgency in the country. So in 1996, the Taliban were in Kabul, they took over Kabul. So this is the, the what we call the civil war period. So from the communist rule in late 1970s to the fall of communism and the disintegration of the PDPA in 1992 and the emergence of the Mujahideen government in the same year and the civil war period from 1992 to 1996 and the eventual collapse of the Mujahideen government and the Taliban, the rise of the Taliban to power in 1996. So the Mujahideen factions, what they did, they withdrew to northern Afghanistan, to Takhar and Badakhshan, those provinces. So where they continued to operate as the Northern Alliance during the Taliban period. So the Taliban period was from 1996 to 2001. So during this period, India, Russia, Central Asian republics, etc., they were backing the Northern Alliance against the Taliban. But the Taliban controlled most of the countries, most of Afghanistan's territories, except to the northern provinces. But in 2001, the rest is history. 2001, after the 9/11 attack, the United States went into Afghanistan, bringing down the Taliban regime. But now, 20 years down the line, you have the Taliban back in Kabul.
How do you look at the Doha agreement with the Islamabad agreement of the early 90s? Because some people see enormous similarities between the Doha agreement, which paved way for Taliban to recapture Afghanistan, and the early 90s Islamabad agreement. What are the similarities do you see?
Yeah, similarities, broadly speaking, the Islamabad agreement brought the Mujahideen to power. So Afghanistan, you look at Afghanistan's history. Afghanistan, when it was ruled by the monarchy, from the 18th century until the collapse of the monarchy in 1973, or when Afghanistan was the republic under President Dawood Khan, or when Afghanistan was under the communist regime. So Afghanistan has never been ruled by the Mullahs. No, not the modern Afghanistan. That actually happened in the early 1990s with the rise of the Mujahideen to power in Afghanistan. Doha agreement, what happened is that it practically brought the Taliban back to power in Afghanistan, Doha agreement. But the Islamabad agreement actually took place after the fall of the government, Najibullah government. Najibullah tried to flee the country, he couldn't flee the country. He could reach the airport, he was stopped by the Mujahideen, and then he was sent back, he took refuge at the United Nations compound in Kabul. And in 1996, when the Taliban took power, they stormed the UN compound, dragged him out, and lynched him, hung his body from a lamppost outside Afghanistan's presidential palace. What I was saying that the agreement, 1992 agreement was formed after the fall of the Najibullah government. So the Pakistanis stepped in. They brought together all these different Mujahideen factions. What they wanted was, some kind of a government model in Kabul for stability, and they also wanted to protect their own interests in 1992. But here, the similarity is this. But at the same time, here the difference is that you see, in 1990s the Soviets were already out, and the conflict was actually going on between the PDPA, which was also led by Afghanistan, supported by Soviet Union earlier until its disintegration, and the Mujahideen factions, who were supported by the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. Here in 2000, but the main contradiction was between the Taliban, which is the Sunni militant organization, insurgency, and the United States, because the US military presence is there. And the Doha agreement was actually signed between the Americans and the Taliban, whereas the Islamabad agreement was signed between different Mujahideen factions. different Afghan factions. And then they formed a government. That government didn't survive. That's a different matter. But Doha Agreement signed between the United States and the Taliban. So practically what the Doha Agreement did, Doha Agreement actually, it set the stage for the Taliban to make a comeback in Kabul. Why? Because the United States, after fighting 20 years in Afghanistan, the United States eventually realized that this war is not sustainable. Because, 20 years of fighting $3 trillion, at its peak, some 120,000 American troops were there in Afghanistan, nation building, elections, democracy. You had everything in the last 20 years. But then 20 years later, more than half of the country was controlled by the Taliban. And the United States, being the world's most powerful country, world's most powerful economy, they can't just pack their bag and leave. They need some kind of a mechanism, at least to convince themselves to leave the country. So Doha Agreement was actually, it allowed the United States, or it gave the United States a way out. What the United States wanted was a face-saving exit from Afghanistan. Whereas on the other side, it also set the stage for the Taliban to make a comeback. Because in the Doha Agreement, the Afghan government was not part of it. The Taliban told the Americans that we wouldn't come to talks if you are involving the Afghan political leadership. We would hold talks only with you because we don't recognize the Afghan government. And the Americans agreed. They said, fine. And the Trump administration appointed a special envoy, Ambassador Khalilzad. They held multiple rounds of talks in Doha. And the agreement was signed in 2020 February between the United States, between Zalmay Khalilzad and the Taliban's political office. And as part of the agreement, the Taliban did not offer any major compromise for the Afghan political problem. What the Taliban said was that we would not allow terrorist organizations to operate on Afghanistan soil. That was what Taliban's main promise was. Taliban's selling point was that. And the United States accepted it. And in return, the Americans said that by 2021, we would, originally 2021, May 31st, we would leave Afghanistan. So that was the agreement. So I think in effect, what happened was that it gave the United States a kind of a face-saving exit. The Americans could claim that we left Afghanistan, but we have got assurances from the Taliban that they would not harbor Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, etc., etc. And that's what our key concern is. And the rest is up to the Afghan people. That's what President Biden said. Whereas on the other side, it legitimized the Taliban, right? The Taliban, for the Taliban, they signed an agreement with the United States. They held direct negotiations with the United States. So it legitimized the Taliban. And 15 days before the United States completed its withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Taliban were back in power in Kabul.
At this stage, I would like to invite Ananth. What is propelling Beijing to take part in Afghanistan after looking at the huge losses of both Soviet Union and the United States? Are they taking any lessons from these two experiments, or they are thinking that they can outsmart these two superpowers?
No, that's a great question. And first of all, thank you so much, and a pleasure to join you all, both two former colleagues, present colleague and former colleague. And also, I should add that I'd spent time at RMRL while researching my master's many years ago. So it's nice to be involved again with this event. I think that for Stanley and I, one of the things that really intrigued us about this question that you pose, what is it that China is doing, is that in July 2021, when you had the Taliban travel to China and meet with the Chinese leadership, and we thought that, that gave us a sort of a lot of things to think about. And actually, that's how this book even came about, based on our discussions over this visit, which to us sort of signaled how that this is something different, where in the past, of course, China wanted to come in and invest. But the fact that they were now sort of seeing themselves as being involved in domestic politics by engaging with the Taliban, this was before they came to power. This is something new about how China is exerting power, not just in Afghanistan, but you see that in Nepal, you see that in Sri Lanka as well. where they are now, I think it just goes to show a change and evolution in Chinese diplomacy, where they see themselves as a preeminent regional power who can be part of what's happening in these places. So I think that one of the things that we do in this book, just to give you a sense of how we look at the China factor, is we look at the past, a little bit on the history, the Silk Road, which actually bound China and Afghanistan. We look at China's experience with Taliban 1.0, and that was not a very good experience for China. And we point to how Chinese people, Chinese experts, how they look at the Taliban, how they look at Afghanistan, the fact that, all of us remember the destruction of the Buddhas in Bamiyan. And actually for people in China, that was what they associated with the Taliban. So now that the Taliban are coming back, this is something we speak about in some detail, how China is kind of, even to its own public, trying to reframe what the Taliban stand for. They're downplaying some of their hardline elements. They're presenting them as, people of the grassroots. In fact, we even point out that you had one Chinese expert who was comparing them to Mao's communist revolutionaries as being the people of the grassroots who had the support of the public as opposed to the elites. So why they are sort of reframing this and making the Taliban seem as acceptable, which is very different from how they dealt with them earlier, I think it just goes to show China's increased regional ambitions. To the question that you asked, are they trying to do what the Soviet Union did? Are they trying to do what the US did? I think the answer so far is quite clearly no. I think they're very clear that they have no intent to go in a big way and, for instance, put boots on the ground. And one of the things we talk about in the book is what lessons they are trying to draw from past mistakes. And I think there are two trends here that I think that are important for us to pay attention to. The first is that this increased Chinese influence, this increased Chinese presence in Afghanistan as a power player, even if they're not going in militarily, coincided with the fact that America was losing its resolve to sustain the project there. And at the same time, Xi Jinping coming to power in late 2012 and early 2013. I think that marked a new phase in China's regional diplomacy, and especially the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, which had an explicit focus on China's neighborhood. And at that point of time, it coincided with what Ashraf Ghani was trying to do in terms of infrastructure and the like. And I think that those are two important trends, and especially the trend of China-US rivalry, something we can talk about in the Q&A, how they're looking at so many regional developments, including Afghanistan, from the perspective of their number one sort of diplomatic priority, strategic priority, which is this almost obsessive focus with the US. And that's why when you had the US exit, it was a moment of celebration for China. They wanted to show, they were comparing it to Vietnam, and they wanted to show that American power is not what it used to be. But at the same time, I think in the book, we point out that I think a lot of people misread this Chinese jubilation as signaling the fact that they were going to replace America. That was a misreading. The jubilation was more to sort of expose American weaknesses. But what hasn't changed is the Chinese are still very, I would say they're still cautious and pragmatic. They're waiting to see how, first of all, in any situation, they wait to see if there's political stability before going in a big way with investments. And I think that there is still a of the Taliban that remains for all that they've been saying publicly. I think that some of the scholars that we have spoken to, I think it's very clear that they are aware that the Taliban hasn't completely changed its tune as Americans wanted people to believe. I think that China's sort of wariness of Islam in general, which you've seen in what they're doing in Xinjiang, I think that'll be a huge note of caution in how they continue to go forward. So just to sort of leave the point there, so far signs are they still remain cautious, pragmatic, and do not want to repeat the mistakes of the past, while at the same time being more forceful to protect their own interests there.
So one thing which you have said in your book is you are using the Silk Road diplomacy for all the initiatives and the investments of China. And idea of invoking Silk Road is to have an idea of heritage or idea of a past which is continuing in that area. how much of this shadow of the past do you think China is invoking by using the Silk Road or the Silk Route part in this region?
Yeah, as you said, I think a lot of it is just more about the narrative power of saying that China was always a player here. But I think, of course, you can exaggerate that, because if you look at the fact that as we also mentioned in the book, it was the fact that you had Buddhists in Bamiyan, which was a big center of Buddhism, and you had Chinese travelers come there and then go back, take scriptures there. At the end of the day, the fact was that it was replaced by Islam there, and you had this. In much more recently, you had the Taliban pretty much taking dynamite to this big legacy of China's presence, or at least of this link that China has been trying to play up. So I think a lot of it, to be frank, it's a sort of narrative device they've used with other countries in the region as well, which is why they've come up with this new Silk Road idea, which is essentially to make the point. I think the subtext to the point is that they are saying that historically they were at the center of all of these trading routes in Asia. And as Xi Jinping put it, they believe they're now coming back to the center stage. And this is their way of sort of legitimizing what they're doing now, which is saying that we were historically there, hence it is natural for China to come back again and play a prominent role there. So I think a lot of invoking the past is to lay the groundwork for them to play a much more prominent role regionally, not just in Afghanistan, but elsewhere as well.
See, one of the reading is that the strategic assets created by India, none of them managed to exercise power beyond their date of really ruling. It happened with Najibullah. Najibullah took refuge in India for some time before he going back. Varadaraja Perumal took refuge in India after the collapse of the Northeast government in Sri Lanka. And Dalai Lama is another best example. And now, if India's strategic assets are not going to provide that strategic buffer, how do you think India is going to look at this multi-layered initiative of China in spreading its spheres of influence in this region?
You know, I think Stanley would also probably have more to say on this. But one thing I would say is I would look at all those three things you mentioned differently. I think whether it's Sri Lanka or Tibet or Afghanistan, I think all of them are, I think, have very specific contexts. And I might not draw a common link between what's happening there in terms of India's influence or assets and the Chinese coming in. I think, or Nepal for that matter, I think all of these have sort of different factors at play. And especially with, for example, Sri Lanka and Nepal, even though we speak a lot about India-China competition there, I think that we should also, if you look at what's happening in Sri Lanka at the moment, I think it's quite clear that India has much closer links in terms of whether it's people, whether it's the presence of people and the movement of people, and China still is nowhere near that in terms of the closeness of linkages in South Asia. Of course, it's changing now, but I would say that China is nowhere near that level of integration and influence that India has. I don't think we've come to that stage yet. But in terms of how the Chinese look at it, I think that, in fact, something that I was just writing today for tomorrow's paper on China and Sri Lanka is that I think one thing that characterizes the way they look at it is that I think it's a mistake to think they invest in only one particular leadership, whether it's Rajapaksa's in Sri Lanka or the Maoists in Nepal. And I think what they try and do is, I think it's a very economic power diplomacy where they feel that whichever government comes to power, that they will not be in a position to say no to Chinese investment. You saw that when the Rajapaksas first left and the Sirisena government took over, the projects that China were involved were paused. They reviewed it because of public concern, but ultimately they went ahead with it. So I think that it's a very sort of pragmatic, economics-driven diplomacy in all of these places. And I think they so far haven't come to the stage where they're putting all the eggs in a particular political power in these places. And we saw in the book, we also explained, as far as Afghanistan was concerned, the Taliban visit to China in July 2021, a few weeks before the fall of Kabul, got a lot of attention. But till the very last days, they were still engaging with of money, and the phone call between Xi Jinping and Ghani right before, even as his government was collapsing. So I think they've been doing in the region.
See, one thing which is coming out very clearly in your book is the anxiety about the Islamic fundamentalism and also about the attack on the Bamiyan and everything else. But this gender element, how much does it play with the Beijing leadership?
No, that's a good question. If I had to answer it very simply, I would say not at all. But I think there hasn't been at all much concern about any human rights issues in Afghanistan or elsewhere. And that sort of speaks to China's broader sort of position on human rights, which is a very defensive one, since they've been facing their own criticism for everything, for whether what they've been doing in Hong Kong or Tibet or Xinjiang, they generally sort of take the position that they don't comment or involve themselves in what happens on human rights issues elsewhere, because they come from this very defensive position. So far, they haven't, if I recall, the only thing they've said about the Taliban since they've come to power is that early on they said they wanted it to be an inclusive government, and so they kept repeating this phrase inclusive government, and ultimately of course that never happened. Once it was clear that there wasn't going to be an inclusive government, they pretty much have sort of disregarded that phrase and disregarded that expectation and carried on with the Taliban. It's not, and there's no evidence, I think, that they've raised it or pressured the Taliban to take those steps. What they have done is pressured them to make a break with extremist groups that they have been very forceful about, especially extremist groups with links to China like ETIM. But when it comes to the domestic issues, so far, they haven't been, to be fair, they have not been very forceful at all in raising whether it's women's issues or treatment of minorities in Afghanistan.
See, this is the same thing what we witnessed in Myanmar, where none of these issues have been raised. Therefore, what we are witnessing is a Beijing which looks at all its international affairs purely from my economic interests, and where its strategic expansion is based on the economic rights rather than other human rights issues. How do you look at a new power emerging and spreading purely on economic interests, which is free of any other political concerns?
I think that's the reason why Chinese investment, I think, continues to be welcomed in many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, because governments feel, I mean, without taking a judgment on it, governments feel that it comes without strings attached and without, I hear this a lot from, African diplomats, for instance, in Beijing, who say that, they are not lectured about, their conduct. And that's, I think that's a big reason why Chinese investment has come up in such a big way in all of these countries. Of course, it has come up with problems as well. I think not because of the fact that it's not tied to political demands or human rights demands, but because of the fact that, as you've seen in Sri Lanka, even though I think China accounts for maybe 10% of their debt, but it's very clear that one flip side to this is often the arrangements are opaque, that they're not very transparent in terms of the financial arrangements that are struck between China and partner countries. On the one side, it's welcome because they don't link it to political issues, but the negative side of that is you've seen that in Africa, you've seen that I think in Southeast Asia as well, that sometimes they come in and projects happen without transparency, without a public debate or environmental assessments. We saw that with dam projects in Myanmar. Whether or not they change that remains to be seen. Recently, there's been a lot of sort of reflection in China, including with the Sri Lanka crisis, that they need to be much more careful about the deals they get into because of even the financial problems that China is dealing with at home. There's no longer a situation where they can freely go in and invest overseas without taking more due diligence. And they realize they are having problems in multiple countries with projects that were rushed through and not given due diligence. I don't think that pattern of Chinese lending can continue, or nor do they want it to continue. What we saw from 2013 to 2018-19 when the first 5-6 years of the Belt and Road, they were so keen to show how much they were investing abroad, that a lot of money went out without scrutiny that should have been there. And so I think that phase of Chinese overseas investment is over. But to go back to your question, I think it is linked in the sense that it was welcomed for that particular reason as well.
Stanley, how do you look at this expansion using only economic fulcrum rather than other political issues?
I think overall, if you look at great powers' foreign policy, it's been driven by their own interests. So the Chinese are also doing the same thing. So they practically look at foreign policy through the perspective of their own interests, and it's their stated policy that they were not, really concerned about, or rather they are not influenced by, their decisions would not be influenced by the domestic politics of a second country. So in fact, recently we were talking with a Chinese diplomat, and then the Chinese official was saying that Afghanistan has got the best possible government at this point of time that its national conditions allow it to have. So that's how the Chinese look at it. So whatever the Taliban are doing, I don't think, or our book clearly states that there are no evidences to suggest that the Taliban 2.0 would be different from the Taliban 1.0, if you look at it from an ideological point of view. The Taliban have never said that they have changed. Their ideology hasn't changed. If you look at even the policies they implemented, they came to power 20 years after. The secondary schools for women, girls are still not open. There are restrictions on women's movement. And it is a very much Pashtun, men-only government. And Afghanistan is it's a very diverse country. You have Pashtuns, you have Hazaras, you have Tajiks, Uzbeks, and then also you have Shias and Sunnis. But you look at, this is a Sunni Pashtun-led government, Pashtun-only government. So the Taliban haven't changed much. So my point is that would not influence not just China's concerns, even other countries also. I think just when it comes down to protecting their interests or advancing their interests, I don't think these factors would deter them. Even if you look at India seemed to be more, more open this time to engage the Taliban government, unlike in the 1990s. In the 1990s, India was supporting the anti-Taliban factions, right, the Northern Alliance. But this time, you have a BJP government at power led by Narendra Modi. And the Taliban is a Sunni extremist organization. But even the apparent ideological or sectarian differences do not prevent the government in New Delhi from reaching out to the Taliban. So the Indian government had sent a delegation of MEA just a few weeks ago. So it's evident that India wants to stay engaged with the government in Afghanistan. That is because their interests, I think their policies are determined by the regional and domestic reality of Afghanistan. Because unlike in the 1990s, at this point of time, there is no Northern Alliance. The Taliban seem to be more powerful. And the regional powers, the countries that opposed the Taliban in the 1990s, you look at Russia, Central Asian republics, they are not embracing the Taliban. They have all taken a wait and watch approach. But certainly they are not pumping in money to support any kind of rebellion against the Taliban at this point of time. So my point is that this, policies driven by the economic outlooks or their own interests, I think most countries, especially great powers, when it comes to their policy making, they do the same thing. The United States do the same thing. They talk about, freedom, foreign policy, liberal values, etc., etc. Only when it suits their policy goals. But all this perceived commitment, the declared commitment towards freedom and liberalism, etc., etc., do not stop President Biden going to Saudi Arabia tomorrow, meeting Mohammed bin Salman. or do not stop President Biden, or do not stop, deter any American government from deepening ties with Israel, which has been occupying Palestinian territories for the last 70 years, flouting all international norms. So my point is that when it comes to your interests, more or less all these countries follow their own national interests besides what they talk.
On that note, I'm going to pose my last question before opening the floor. This question is to both of you. In this reality, or in the geopolitical reality, do you think that Quad is going to be an effective countervailing mechanism, or Quad is a hypothetical formation?
I think Ananth would be in a better place to answer this, but I will just say one thing. I think, it is too early to say which form Quad will take. At this point of time, it remains a grouping. It's not an alliance. It's not a military or defense alliance. It remains a grouping of 4 countries who share some kind of common interest. And all 4 might be looking at China as a counterweight. If it's not today, definitely in the future. So this brings together the Quad members. But at this point of time, I think Quad is yet to take a proper structure. It remains a grouping where leaders would meet and they could discuss common goods like vaccines, etc., etc. But we don't know what kind of a structure it would take in the future, provided that the geopolitical contest between the United States and China would become far more sharper in the coming years. So Ananth might be able to provide more light on.
Ananth.
No, I would agree with Stanley in terms of, I think we have to wait and see how it evolves and goes forward. I think we sometimes are in a time of very extreme judgments where I think half the commentators say that the Quad is irrelevant and the other half say that, it's going to do everything and more. So I would sort of agree with Stanley's assessment that I think it's still a very sort of flexible grouping, and it's not an alliance, and I don't think it will become an alliance because India will want to maintain that autonomy that it has. But at the same time, I think there's also a huge potential for it, especially I think security-wise, there's been a huge sort of step up in what they've been able to do in terms of maritime security. But I think the big question mark is, can they deliver in non-security domains? And so this vaccine initiative is a good example of both the opportunities that it has, but also the challenges, because the vaccine initiative has struggled in terms of it hasn't really delivered yet. So I think that's the big question mark. And I think the thing that I hear a lot in the region, in East Asia, is that there's a desire to have an economic alternative to China. So it's of course that many of these countries have good security relations with the US, but they're saying that that's not the only thing they want. They want economic. Many of these countries have China as the biggest trading partner, as the biggest investor, and there still hasn't been, besides Japan, there still hasn't been a concerted attempt to provide that alternative. And at Quad, I think on the economic domain has so far been quite weak, and I think that will ultimately sort of decide whether or not it can really become a very credible counterweight to China in the region.
Now let's open questions, please. There. Could you please identify yourself before asking the question?
Hi, my name is Murli.
No, we can't hear you.
My name is Murli. I'm a researcher.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if China really, the diplomats in China really understand or are able to convey the ground realities to the decision makers, right? Like that's for example, BW says like China just makes these investments which could be white elephants. It's just like they just end up creating white elephants, right? Like for example, the port or the airport and the huge stadium in Sri Lanka. And it's like nobody really uses them, and then it just causes. I think Ananth pointed to this, right? Like he was saying, maybe it's not strategic enough. Maybe they don't convey the realities of ground. It's just they're just spreading. They're just throwing things and just seeing if some sticks, especially in Africa. Do they really understand their investments?
The one point that I would make is, I think we tend to look at, Chinese projects in any country as being this one entity investing in it. But actually, if you look at it, it's a very fragmented, it's very chaotic, it's very messy. It's not a situation where every project is going to be okayed by you'd be surprised to hear this, but it's not the situation where every project, even though this is China we're talking about, would necessarily be strictly approved by the foreign ministry. Foreign ministry is actually a weak agency in China. So when you have a big Chinese state-owned company deciding to go in and do a project, no one is going to sort of scrutinize it. And, these are huge, powerful entities in it themselves in China. So I think people who study Chinese projects abroad see a very sort of, at least in the last few years, it's a very fragmented, messy, uncoordinated kind of thing that's going on. I think sometimes we give them too much credit that, everything they do is thought of 20 years in advance. They're strategic, long-term thinkers, etc., etc. We say that, but I think the day-to-day is actually quite, it's quite more messy. And you've seen that in the way investments have gone abroad. You've seen that in the way, as you highlighted some of those projects. But I would also add one thing, which is that in a lot of these things, it's the partner countries. We kind of forget the sort of kind of agency and responsibility that the partner countries have, whether it's in Sri Lanka or Zambia. I think that many of these projects, these dead projects, I think in many of these cases are less reflective of, or not only reflective of how Chinese investment goes abroad, but often are a symptom of economic mismanagement that's a much broader problem, not just tied to the investments with China. I think you've seen that in Sri Lanka, you've seen that in a few African countries as well. And I think in many cases, it's a symptom of a particular leadership that isn't doing its job very well, if that kind of answers your question.
Can take two more questions. Oh, yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your information. First, let me introduce myself during 1 minute, and then during 1 minute, my remarks, and then the third minute, 2 questions. Myself, I am from Pondicherry, so I speak French. That's my first language. English is not my first one. It's third or even fourth, I would say. Anyway, because of the echo, I didn't hear very well. So maybe I was a little bit upset by that. But anyway, if the question is, you understand the question, you can answer. On the remarks, well, I studied in France, and then, yes, I studied in France, and then I have made research in history, not only South Indian history, but history in the international relations, northwest of India and southeast of India. Let us say first, now the remarks. I was in Vietnam, and I witnessed everything which happened, between 1964, when the Americans were only 50,000, and 1968, when they became 500,000, that means 10 times more. Okay, and so I witnessed everything. I was there in 25. So I know international relations and the attitude of India towards the Southeast Asia. Now, geographically, Sri Lanka, you mentioned several times Sri Lanka, it is south of India. But in the 1950s, it was considered as a Southeast Asia because, certainly Colombo Plan. In Colombo Plan, people talk much about Burma, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Sri Lanka, because considered as Southeast. And this other last remark is that India was always looking relatively north and west, but not enough, according to me, south and east. But now it is changing. So regarding Afghanistan, there is one question. You mentioned several times Afghanistan, Taliban, and so on. The question is, what was the attitude of India with Masood, against Masood, not against, I don't find the word, where, towards Masood. Now is no more, his son is now is living. What is the attitude of India towards the son, Masood? That's the question for Afghanistan. Now for the in Southeast Asia, for Vietnam, India was the president, because the third world was the president of International Commission. Canada for the West and Poland for East. And India was the president. I think until 64, Nehru was the president also, because he was the foreign minister. Later on, I don't know. Now, Burma, for example, has become largely, not, I won't say Chinese colony, but Chinese affair. And still, I think that India is not present. The question is about the Southeast Asia is, what is the attitude of India towards Burma and towards Vietnam now? Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the questions and the comment. Regarding Ahmad Shah Massoud, when Massoud was alive, he was the defense minister, and then he was commanding the Northern Alliance from Badakhshan and Dhaka. India had cultivated very warm ties with Ahmad Shah Massoud. So apparently in the book, in one chapter, there is one chapter about India and the Taliban, in which we write, in the 1990s, mid-1990s, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, he sent a special diplomat to Afghanistan, especially to northern Afghanistan, to meet with Ahmad Shah Massoud. At that time, Massoud's faction was, the Taliban hadn't taken over power yet. Taliban takes power in 1996. Massoud was the defense minister. He was part of the Mujahideen government, but he was largely operating from the Panjshir Valley. So Ambassador Badragumar, he's still writing about Afghanistan and Central Asia, etc., etc. Ambassador Badragumar was a young diplomat, and Prime Minister Nehru dispatched him. And then he travels. He goes to Kabul, and from Kabul to Panjshir, and in Panjshir, he meets with Ahmad Shah Massoud. So he was the, basically it was Ambassador Badragumar who kind of started cultivating ties with Massoud. And once the Taliban took power, Massoud and his forces retreated to Panjshir. And from Panjshir Valley, Panjshir, Badakhshan, and Dhaka, these three provinces, became the base of the anti-Taliban forces. India continued to work with them. So India was providing support, monetary support, as well as other support to Ahmad Shah Massoud and his factions. So India was coordinating with Iran, Russia, and Central Asian republics, especially Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And we were supporting, the Indian government was supporting the Massoud faction. So this was the relationship India had with Ahmad Shah Massoud in the 1990s. But as you know, in 2001, February 9th, Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated by Al-Qaeda just 2 days prior to the September 11 attack, because Al-Qaeda wanted to assassinate him first. Taliban also wanted the same thing before they go ahead with the attack. And then with Massoud Jr., his son is now reportedly, we don't know. Some say he's based in Panjshir, some say he's in Uzbekistan or in Tajikistan, but he's in that part. And he is still defiant of the Taliban. He commands a small faction of the rebels. Uh, Former Afghanistan's Vice President Amarullah Saleh is also largely associated with this faction. But we don't know whether India is offering them any direct support yet. So as of now, I think India is not doing it because our priority is now is to have some kind of a working mechanism with the government of the day in Kabul. That's what we understand when you look at India's policies. So the Taliban now consider Masood Jr. as their main enemy inside the country and Amarullah Saleh. And the Tajikistan government is kind of offering support to, at least refuge to Amarullah Saleh and his men. But India is not very keen, at least at this point of time. We don't know whether the equation would change in the future. Yeah. Maybe Ananth would like to take the Southeast Asia question.
Ananth, please.
Yeah. And to be honest, yeah, not much to say besides that. I think obviously there's been a big gulf between India's stated ambitions. You first had Look East, then you had Act East. But from my own sort of the last 2 years, the visits that I've had to several of the ASEAN capitals, I think they do see more Indian interest, more Indian intent. But I think the follow through is always, especially in terms of following it up with commitments, is something that I think still leaves a lot to be desired. But of course, it's also a thing. Of course, it's also a question of finite resources. I think that India's focus, understandably, has been on South Asia, and I think that often you have finite resources. But of course, there's no question that I think that there is, just to reiterate what I said earlier, there's a common refrain is there's a huge desire for alternatives to China. So I think that gap is there, that opportunity is there, but it remains to be seen. I think what India seems to be wanting to do now is to do that more in sync with Japan, especially in sync with the Quad. And I think that might be the way to go, given that India does not have the pockets to be that alternative to China on its own. I think that's one of the interests that India sees in the Quad is to coordinate with these countries and do that. And I think that ultimately, as I said earlier, the big question mark is whether or not they can actually deliver and follow through. So I think that's still an open question.
We can take one more question before we wrap it up. Is there any online questions? Dharni, please.
Thank you so much for both of you for coming to our reading hub event. I'm Dharnidharan. I'm one of the spokespersons for the DMK as well as the executive coordinator of the Dravidian Professional Forum. So myself have some experience in international relations. I went to Moscow and Paris, and I've also wrote an article to the Wire, a couple of articles on the Afghanistan Taliban issue in the month of August. So my question is, do you think the Indian government reacted a bit late in dealing with the Taliban? Because if you know, even before the Taliban took over Kabul, the Chinese foreign minister, in fact, received Taliban leaders and they had discussions. For example, India per se, for months, did not have an official position and they did not know if they have to interact with Taliban or not. We have actually invested about $3 billion $3 trillion over the years in infrastructure because we wanted to have soft power and we wanted to use Afghanistan as a bulwark against terrorism. And so that's the question one. And question two, how do you think it alters the world order? Because now US is seen weak because no one expected a situation in which the American embassy staff would have to be airlifted. So even a week before Taliban kind of occupied Kabul, Biden had said that it'll be months before Kabul would fall. So do you think that America is losing its power, and what do you how do you see this as the changing scenario in South China Sea? How would it play against Japan, Taiwan, and so on and so forth? These two are my questions. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll quickly answer the first question. Compared to other countries in the region, China, Russia, Iran, we can say that India was late to reach out to the Taliban, which is true. Because in 2015 in the Islamabad Muri talks, the Chinese had sent a delegation. Even the Iranians had reached out to Taliban in the past, before the Taliban actually took over. The Russians had hosted them in Moscow. But at the same time, I think we should also understand that India unlike the other countries, India faced structural impediments in its relationship with the Taliban. Because it is not only the past of the 1990s. 1990s, all these countries had issues with the Taliban, including Iran. But none of these countries faced this Pakistan factor. But India had this Pakistan factor. Because Pakistan, India, a country which India sees as its main, as a prominent geopolitical rival across the border, has been bankrolling the Taliban. So I think, whereas for the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians, they do not see this external factor in their engagement with the Taliban. So India was late, but at the same time, I think India also had concerns when it comes to establishing, some kind of an engagement with the Taliban. But once the Taliban took over Kabul, I don't think you don't have any other options but to at least engage the Taliban. Because if you want to protect your interests, your investments, $3 billion investments, or if you don't want Afghanistan to host anti-India militant organizations like it did in the 1990s, or if you want to explore the Taliban's autonomy from Pakistan in the future. So you take any scenario, you won't meet your goals unless you have some kind of an engagement with the government in Afghanistan. Now, Taliban is the government in Afghanistan, whether you like it or not.
Ananth.
I think that so far they've been quite. I mean, if you look at the South China Sea as an example, just to speak briefly on the maritime security situation in the region, I think that was what the heart of your question was about. Unless I missed it. So far, they have been quite, I think, conservative in pushing back on what China wants to do. I mean, if you look back at the last 10, 15 years, for everything that they've been saying, for instance, the US has been saying publicly on the South China Sea, they haven't really confronted China on it, and China has gone ahead and done what it planned to do by, militarizing those islands, creating those artificial islands and reefs, etc. So I think there's been a reluctance to directly confront them for what it would lead to. As far as South China Sea is concerned, and similar with the Quad, I mean, they've, beyond doing freedom of navigation operations in international waters, they haven't really taken steps that would cross the red line as far as China sees it, which is, sailing right within what it claims to be, its territorial islands or reefs. I think Taiwan is something that we should all watch out and see how it goes, because I think the South China Sea is one thing, but I think there seems to be an evolution in, for instance, if you look at what Japan has been saying and even what the US has been saying on whether or not they would intervene in the event of a Chinese attempt to take military action on the Taiwan question. I think we still don't know. The US still maintains what it calls strategic ambiguity, but I think that's something we have to wait and see. From Beijing, what you hear from what the experts say and write in the papers is they favor preserving the status quo, which is the current status quo, which they see as Taiwan not declaring outright independence, and this current situation continuing. And they claim that if they see any big change in the status quo undertaken by Taiwan with the support of the US, then they wouldn't rule out any action. My own personal reading, I mean, it's a fool's errand to predict how these things happen, but I think that changing the status quo in a big way would be a huge risk for China and the Chinese leadership, given that Taiwan is such a huge issue as far as their legitimacy is concerned, and especially in the current situation of the next term beginning for the leadership. I think the last thing they'd want is anything potentially destabilizing. But I would watch the Taiwan question and see how it goes, especially because you've seen a changed intent, at least so far, from the US and Japan in what they'd be prepared to do to deter Chinese action.
Thank you, Ananth. Thank you, Stanley. And thank you all of you for joining us. Next month, we'll be having 2 more books. We'll share it with you as soon as we finalize it. Thank you.